Well, thanks again. Tonight we're going to start this examination of the life and legacy of Martin Luther King. And as a biographer, I've tried to get to know King, to understand him, and get a sense of the kind of man he was. So what I want to begin doing this afternoon is by stressing three of the key things that, as far as I can see, really shaped Martin's character. And in one way, his name, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., gives us plenty of clues as to the key things that shaped the man he became. So initially, I'm going to be talking about his faith and about his family. He became one of the world's most famous preachers, and there's now a library of books trying to probe and understand his theology. And I'm going to offer a little of that in layman's terms tonight. But he was also junior, a man powerfully shaped by his family and by his sense of family. So there were times when Martin Luther King told people that he really wished he could just be a simple preacher. But he would not be remembered as he is, had that been true. And that leads us to the third part of the talk that I'm going to give now, which is about the role of the actual civil rights struggle itself in making Martin the man he came to be and the man we now remember. One of the most influential figures of the civil rights movement in the early 60s was a woman called Ella Baker, and she helped Martin set up his organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. In an oral history interview after King's death, Miss Baker famously declared that the movement made Martin more than Martin made the movement. And that's also something I want to consider tonight. So, what is it that makes a man? What makes somebody's personality? I think most of us would agree that family plays a big part. You don't need to believe in, some rigid idea of genetic inheritance to accept that the people you're close to as a child really have a big influence. And as this picture shows on the left-hand side as you look at it, King grew up in a close-knit family. His father's name was Michael, and King was always named after him. The birth certificate for Martin Luther King, dated January the 15th, 1929, has Michael King as the given name. And close family friends throughout his life called him Mike. He had an elder sister, Christine, who's still alive, seated in the middle in this picture, and a younger brother, Adam Daniel, seated to the left of Christine, who, like Martin, became a preacher and died young. A.D. was named after his mother's father, the Reverend A.D. Williams, who had founded the Ebenezer Baptist Church on Auburn Avenue in Atlanta. And A.D. Williams was still pastor when Michael Jr., future Martin Luther King Jr., was born. King's maternal grandmother continued to live with the family after Williams' death in 1931, so the two older women in this picture are his grandmother Jenny and his mother Alberta. Even allowing for the fact that people in the 30s dressed up to go downtown to the photo studio to get their picture taken, the photo suggests that the King family were pretty well off, especially in the context of 1931, which is heading into the midst of the Great Depression, when many Americans, and especially African Americans, were suffering hard times. In one of the essays he wrote while he was in college, Martin wrote about his comfortable family life, how it made it possible for him to believe in a loving God and a universe that could be just. Elsewhere, he also implied that this faith in God's love was very much instilled by his mother and his grandmother. He recalls in particular that his first religious crisis, the first moment in his life when he really doubted God, was when his grandmother died. He'd stayed out late, as it happened that day, on the day she died, and he even believed that just maybe God was punishing him for disobedience by taking his grandma away. Some accounts suggest he jumped out of an upstairs window in a suicide attempt to try to join her. And it was his mother who talked him through this early trauma in his life. Of course, another key influence on the young Martin was his father, shown on the left here, who seems to have been a far rougher and tougher figure than his wife Alberta. He was known to many in his lifetime, and especially after his son shot to fame, as Daddy King, and his autobiography is a classic American story of a self-made man. He was born a sharecropper's son in rural Georgia, and remembered his own father as a hard-drinking and regularly violent man because of the desperation and frustration he felt at the bottom of a deeply unjust system. Aged just 15, Michael King left his family home after a final clash with his father and walked to Atlanta, where he attended night school to learn to read and write. Like most black preachers of his day, Daddy King did not go to theological college to train to be a minister. He simply answered God's call and induced local congregations to allow him to preach in what his son, somewhat embarrassedly, used to remember as a highly emotive style. But he was good enough to get congregations to invite him back to preach. It was King's relationship, Daddy King's relationship, with the more established Ebenezer Baptist Church pastor A.D. Williams, who had the church on Auburn Avenue, that included his courtship of Williams's daughter, Alberta, that made Daddy King a noted figure in black Atlanta by the 30s. Some said he was the highest paid preacher in the city. And that affluence in a time of scarcity is evident in the fact that he was able to take his wife to Europe in 1934 and to attend a Lutheran conference and make a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. It was after that event that Daddy King renamed himself and his son Martin Luther King. But being a preacher's kid can be a cross to bear. And we have a few indications that Martin Jr. did not automatically fit in with his parents' expectations. So what I'm trying to get at here is that he does change, that there isn't just a Martin Luther King that's there all the way through. In some ways, he fulfilled his parents' expectations from the start. He was very happy to sing along with his mother's recitals in the church, belting out gospel tunes at the age of 7. But he was also, as he readily admitted, prepared to go at the revival to the front altar and say that he'd been saved at the age of about 5, mainly because his sister had gone up as well and he didn't want to get left behind. Just rivalry. A 10-year-old Martin provoked a certain amount of consternation in Sunday school by telling his teacher that there was no way that Jesus rose bodily after his death. He did not believe in the bodily resurrection of Christ. In a fundamentalist church, this was certainly not a good sign from the preacher's son. Parents among you may be unsurprised to learn that the tensions inside the King household intensified during Martin's teenage years. Issues ranged from King's liking of fine clothes. His friends had nicknamed him Tweed. His willingness to dance in a Baptist church that recognized a big difference between praising the Lord in church and the devil's music. And of course, the issue of staying out late and dating. While King does not go into details, it is clear that his daddy would sometimes take his belt to him for these transgressions, even all the way up into college. And others hint that his beloved mother was pretty good at pushing Martin's emotional buttons and giving him a guilt trip. So part of the story is that King set off for college with the intention of not remaining in the family business, namely preaching. He wanted to be a lawyer or a doctor, and his degree major was sociology. Now, since the war had drained colleges of students, King was allowed to enter Morehouse College very early, at the age of 15, in 1944. There he met the college president, Benjamin Mays, who had already made a reputation for himself as a critic of black clergymen. He reinforced in the young Martin the view that religion had to be about something down here on earth, rather than what you believed might happen after death. So the gospel that King accepted was what would be called a social gospel, and this was, in fact, very much the gospel practiced at Ebenezer. But May's modern professional approach to ministry illustrated for Martin a way in which he could follow his father, but be his own man. Another tutor, George Kelsey, taught Martin about the new historical turn in biblical studies, which amplified his reluctance to embrace a literal interpretation of Scripture. But what's probably most revealing about young Martin's need to step out of his father's shadow is his decision after Morehouse to choose a northern theological college, Crozer in Pennsylvania, for the next part of his education. He had already preached a guest sermon at Ebenezer, and it was obvious that he could become co-pastor with his father if he wanted then and there. But he was determined to pursue formal training. He stayed with a family friend, J. Pius Barber, while he was at Crozer, but most of his classmates were white, and he even had a serious relationship with the daughter of one of the white college staff. Now, this was far from what Daddy King wanted, and it's likely that the only thing that placated him was that his son was showing some real intellectual promise. King graduated in 1951 at the top of his class with a college prize to offset the cost of postgraduate study, and with a growing sophistication in his understanding of theology. Now, this may seem a strange way of rebelling against parental control, but Martin was using education to put a distance between him and Daddy's plans. Aged just 22, he enrolled for a doctorate in systematic theology at one of America's preeminent Methodist colleges, Boston University. This not only carried him further north from Atlanta, but also took him beyond the denominational boundaries of the Baptist Church. Now, to be fair to Daddy King, he was proud enough of his eldest son that he gave him a new sports car as a graduation present from Crozier. And this, along with King's snappy dressing and personal charm, ensured that he gained reputation as a popular figure on campus. He organised an evening discussion group called the Dialectical Society, took extra classes in philosophy at Harvard, and as this picture shows on the left-hand side, he was inducted into the leading black fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha. He's on the bottom row, he's the short one on the end. He was 5'7" tall. It really bugged him, and he used to wear little boosts in his shoes. Few things capture the gulf that separated Malcolm X from Martin in 1952 than these two images from the time when they were living closest together. Malcolm was released from Roxbury Penitentiary in 1952, having served a term for burglary, and through his brother had converted to the Nation of Islam with its emphasis on discipline and self-denial. Just a few miles away in Boston, King was studying the different conceptions of God advanced by contemporary Protestant theologians, establishing a reputation for himself by giving guest sermons at black Baptist churches using his father's contacts, and enjoying an affluent bachelor lifestyle. The contrast between the two should not, however, blind us to the things that they had in common. Both men were on spiritual pilgrimages that wrestled with parental influence Malcolm's father, had also been a Baptist preacher. And both men were black men in white America. King always remembered the number of times he went to look at a flat in Boston, and as soon as they saw him in person, he was told that the flat was already let. His contemporaries remember King as quite the ladies' man during his time in Boston, and certainly when he first met a young student at the New England Conservatory of Music, Coretta Scott, who was studying opera, she was wary. As Coretta remembers it, she initially thought he was chatting her up with some pretty well-practiced lines, what she called his intellectual jive. But as he listened, the man speaking before her seemed to grow in stature and presence, which, given Martin's feelings about size, was probably just as well. Nonetheless, she was understandably shocked when he announced at the end of their first date that she had all the qualities that he was looking for in a wife: character, intelligence, personality, beauty. She replied that he barely knew her, and he smoothly used that to ask for a second date. Daddy King had already lined up a match for Martin with a prominent black Atlanta family. So he was far from pleased when Martin got engaged to this Alabama Methodist who had operatic pretensions and a desire to live outside of the South. It appears that Mama King had to intervene to calm her angry husband, and the wedding duly happened in Coretta's hometown of Marion, Alabama, deep in the segregationist South, so the newlyweds had no hotel in town to stay in. They were loaned the most luxurious African-American home in Marion, which allowed King to joke later on that he spent his honeymoon in a funeral parlour, since in many black communities, the wealthiest man in town was the local undertaker. If Daddy King's hopes of a dynastic marriage into Atlanta's black elite had been dashed, Coretta's hopes of a career as an operatic soloist based in New York or Boston or Chicago had also been swept aside. When they married in June 1953, the US Supreme Court was already considering the NAACP lawsuits against segregation in schools. Less than a year later, in 1954, the court ruled in favour of the NAACP and overturned a key basis for racial discrimination. In the meantime, Coretta graduated from the New England Conservatory with a degree in music education. She was trying to be practical. And Martin finished his preliminary exams for his doctorate. To Coretta's dismay, Martin was determined to return south, and the headlines about desegregation gave him an argument that the South was going to be different, it was changing. It was, but in the short term, despite King's hopes, it was actually changing for the worst. King's doctoral thesis compared the conception of God in Paul Tillich and Henry Wyman. One of the reasons why King had chosen Boston University was because it was the centre for a particular style of theology that intrigued him. That was called personalism. Unlike other strands of theology that saw God in very abstract, personal terms, like truth or the life force, personalism saw him as having a personality, as being someone that human beings could have a personal and individual relationship with. And one of the byproducts of this belief was that a central dynamic of religion should be that personal relationship. And that put personalism very much in a Protestant tradition that stressed the personal relationship rather than an indirect relationship through liturgy and sacraments that's common in denominations like Catholicism or Greek Orthodoxy. Personalism also focused attention on moments of discovery within that relationship, some of which fall into the classic narrative of being born again. Perhaps of greatest relevance for King's subsequent politics, personalism also believed that this personal relationship was a natural product of the reality that human beings all contain God. That's what makes humans special and sacred, the God inside them. And this could never be eradicated from them. So when Jesus said, love your neighbour, it was not just a do unto others as they would do unto you, pragmatism, but a declaration that everybody had to be cherished for the God inside, no matter how bad they were. And that's a picture of the police chief in Birmingham, Alabama, Bull Connor. So the reason why King could say he could love his enemies, love Bull Connor, was because he was loving the God inside. Loving your enemies in this sense is almost impersonal, because you love them for the God within that they may not even know or express, rather than who they appear to be. So at this point, it's important to acknowledge that in 1955, when he's taken all these degrees and qualified to be a preacher, Martin Luther King is not the man he's going to later become. That certain facets of his personality indicate that in 54, 55, at the age of 24, he was the product of a family that had in some respects indulged him, even if they instilled social responsibility and purpose. Now, one of Danny King's friends had given Martin a trial, a chance to be a co-pastor in his church. And his report back on the young preacher was far from glowing. He alluded to a certain smugness in Martin and self-importance. He complained about the distance that Martin had with ordinary people that he dealt with in the parish. And it's also the case that Martin had essentially insisted that what he wanted was far more important than what Coretta wanted. And he'd simply assumed that she should stay home and have kids and conduct herself as a dutiful preacher's wife. When it came to getting a ministry, he remained determined to avoid becoming his father's co-pastor, at least immediately, and was comfortable juggling different job offers and negotiating terms. Thus, when he becomes pastor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, he only does it after he's agreed a very good salary for himself and insisted on renovations and improvement to the pastor's house that comes with the job. Finally, in assessing the kind of person Martin Luther King was in 54-55, one has to accept that we have pretty conclusive proof that in writing his doctoral thesis, he copied large sections of it from a previously submitted thesis by another student. In other words, he plagiarized it. When this was revealed by the Martin Luther King Papers Project, based in Stanford, it caused understandable consternation, with some people even demanding that Boston University should posthumously strip its most famous graduate of his degree. King biographer David Lewis confessed that he was so shocked by this revelation that it made him wonder if he'd ever really understood King as a man. So we have to accept the possibility that the King we have in 1954-55 is a young man who wanted the title of doctor for what it could get him and was prepared to cut corners to get it. There are a number of things we have to take into account here. He'd left Boston by the time he was writing the dissertation and was working hard at Dexter Avenue, often writing between 4 a.m. and 8 a.m. in the morning before going on to the daily duties of being a pastor. We also know that Martin Luther King had an absolutely amazing memory for words, and if he caught the rhythm and the cadence of a sentence, he could recite it from memory thereafter. He'd written essays in preparation for the thesis, and these were not all corrected by his tutors in terms of how you're supposed to cite things. The theology department in general seems to have accepted the idea that quoting somebody else without citing them was not intrinsically bad practice. So there are reasons why King might have continued that into his dissertation. But the extent of the borrowing is at least 40% of the whole thing. And the fact that it was taken from another doctoral student does seem to be the kind of practice that a student who's taken 3 degrees at 3 different institutions should know is wrong. So the key point I want to make is that the family and the gospel shaped King in major ways, but ultimately it was the struggle that transformed him. King had learned from his father that a minister could promote activism, and he organised committees at Dexter to promote voter registration and social welfare activities. Dexter was the church of the black elite in Montgomery, with a lot of the faculty from the local black college, Alabama State University, attending. Some of those were already very politically active, and the woman depicted here, proudly showing that she's having a police mugshot taken during the Montgomery bus boycott, is Joanne Robinson, who was leader of the local Women's Political Council. King joined the local NAACP, which was headed by a forceful leader called E.D. Nixon, who was the union rep for the Pullman car porters. The secretary of the local NAACP branch was a very elegant woman called Rosa Parks. Nixon had encouraged Parks to go to the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee that summer to learn about how to pursue school desegregation. And Highlander was a very remarkable place, very different, very special. One of the few places where integrated meetings could occur in the South, and its sole purpose was to promote people's activism and protest. Parks came back. She remembered knowing that she needed to do something. King gave a well-received speech at the NAACP branch when he came to Montgomery, and they invited him to join the executive. But he declined, said that his work pressures and his new family was just too much at the moment. King spent his first year in Montgomery getting to know people. He made close friends with Ralph Abernathy, the pastor of First Baptist Church, a more working-class congregation. The two of them turned up at ministerial meetings so often that colleagues started to talk to them as Mr. Rough, that's Abernathy, and Mr. Smooth. He also came to realise that the school desegregation decision had provoked a wave of hostility that amplified racial tensions and made the mayor and the city commission very reluctant to give any concessions. So this is what sets the stage for the arrest of Rosa Parks on the 1st of December 1955. Parks was a well-established activist, and she'd even had run-ins with the very same bus driver on the bus, J.P. Blake. She was arrested for refusing to comply with the segregation ordinance, which said that the races should not be seated together. African Americans had to sit at the back of the bus. The first 4 rows at the front were for whites only, and behind this section there was a middle section of another 4 rows that could be used by African Americans, but only if no whites needed to sit there. It was from this middle section that Rosa Parks was removed. And just to underline the insult that was intended to African Americans by this law, African Americans had to stand and give up their seats in a row of 4 if one white person needed a seat. It wasn't just you gave up one seat so they could sit down. The entire row had to be cleared. And to ensure no accidental contact, African Americans had to pay their fare at the front of the bus and get off the bus, go to the back door and get back on, so they wouldn't walk through the white section. Parks phoned her NAACP colleague, Nixon, and he went down to the jail and arranged bail. He believed Parks could be the basis of a test case, and when he spoke to Joanne Robinson, she declared that now was the time to pursue the bus boycott that they'd been threatening at previous meetings with the city authorities. Robinson went back to college and ran off leaflets to tell people not to ride the buses on the days of Parks' arraignment in court. Now, Robinson was employed at a state college. The white government paid her salary, so she had to stay in the background, because otherwise the president of that college would sack her to save the money. Black preachers, on the other hand, derived their living from the local white African-American community and were less vulnerable to white pressure. So that's why Nixon needed to get the preachers involved. When Nixon asked King if he could use Dexter's meeting room to gather the ministers together to discuss the boycott, King readily said yes. But when he was asked about what role he would take as the protests carried on, he was non-committal. He arrived late for the meeting, just at the point when the abrasive Nixon had already clashed with the preachers, some of whom wanted to only give anonymous support to the boycott to avoid any retaliation by the white authorities. Nixon got mad as hell with them. He basically said, "You owe your living to the women who are mistreated on those buses. Their nickels and dimes are what pay your salary. And you don't have the guts to support them in this protest?" And it was just at that moment that Martin Luther King walked in and said, "I'll support them. I'm prepared to do it." Now, partly because Nixon had annoyed them so much, the people gathered in that room were determined he was not going to be head of any protest organisation they organised. So they organised the Montgomery Improvement Association and quickly nominated King as its president. King later admitted that if he'd had some time to think, he'd have turned this job down. The others chose him partly because he was bright and articulate, very representative of what they saw as the best in the black community, likely to present their case in the best way to the white authorities, and certainly in that way preferable to Nixon. He was also a relative newcomer to the town and had an influential father to whom he could turn if things went wrong. There is some calculation here that maybe Martin was expendable. Maybe if things did go wrong, he could go back to Daddy King and get a job somewhere else. The other preachers couldn't. Now, King proved his value to the MIA with his first speech at an overflowing mass meeting at Holt Street Baptist Church on December the 5th. The one-day boycott has been a big success. They've now got to decide whether they're going to stay off the buses long-term until the City Commission desegregates. The initial demands of the MIA are really modest. Essentially, seating was going to be allocated to the races on a first-come, first-served basis. Whites will be seated from the front, African Americans from the rear. No one will have to give up their seat. That's the big change. The same practice is already working in Mobile, Alabama. So they don't understand why the city authorities in Montgomery won't do the same thing as other cities are doing in the same state. The MIA also asks that the bus company hires black drivers for the main routes through the black neighbourhoods. But pressed by the City Commission and the White Drivers Union, the bus company refuses. So with no agreement in place by Christmas, the MIA publicises that it's going to continue its protest as one of passive resistance depending on moral and spiritual forces. Now, you can see on the slide up there that there's actually a YouTube link that you can go to, and they've actually got the original recording of Martin Luther King's speech. So you can listen to this speech that was so evocative and compelling that it made him almost immediately the designated leader for the protest. The new year of 1956 saw white intransigence deepen. Most of the City Commission and the Mayor joined a pro-segregation organisation called the Citizens' Council. the local police pursued a policy of intimidation, harassing drivers in the MIA's carpool, and arresting King on a speeding charge. King was starting to feel the pressure, since the MIA was being harassed and he was receiving threatening phone calls, death threats essentially, at all hours of the day and night. He feared not just for himself, but for his wife and their 2-month-old daughter, Yolanda. Disturbed by one such call in the early hours of the morning, King experienced a moment of profound despair, in which he genuinely considered giving up and going back to Daddy King in Atlanta, who would look after him. But as he prayed at his kitchen table, he had what he remembered to be the great spiritual experience that changed his life. He heard a voice telling him to fight on and promising that no matter what he faced in future, he would never have to face it alone. A few nights later, bombers did attack his home and came very close to murdering his sleeping wife and child. An angry crowd of neighbours gathered and were all set on taking revenge when King came home and calmed them, urging them to remain non-violent and to love their enemies. So this underlines the way in which the movement changed Martin. The man he became as a result of the struggle was much stronger and nobler than the man he'd been before. He continued to rally and unite the boycott supporters through the rest of the 1956, almost an entire year, until desegregation of the buses was ordered on December the 17th. Over those many months, he learned about the philosophy of nonviolence from experts from the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and his eloquence drew national and international attention to Montgomery and the boycott. It raised money that kept the boycott going. It excited interest in a mass movement that could take hold in a place like Montgomery, known as the cradle of the Confederacy. By the end of the protest, King had been encouraged to set up a new organisation to promote the use of nonviolent tactics against segregation. So in 1957, he became head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, based in Atlanta, but with affiliates in lots of other southern cities. So the Montgomery Improvement Association becomes an affiliate of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Most of its officers were black preachers like King, and its motto was to redeem the soul of America, underlining its Christian credentials in a nation that was still emerging from the McCarthyite Red Scare. So they didn't want to appear godless communists, and they were all preachers. So the Christian in Southern Christian Leadership Conference was well judged. King quickly discovered that developing the protest movement beyond Montgomery was not going to be easy. White resistance was strong. In Montgomery, there were attacks on the desegregated buses and more bombings of leaders' homes and churches. That's one of the churches bombed in January. Rosa Parks had already been forced to leave Montgomery to find work and escape harassment. When other communities tried to use the boycott tactic, white authorities were prepared to shut down the bus system rather than desegregate. The SCLC needed money. To survive and to promote it, King published a largely ghost-written account of the bus boycott called Stride Towards Freedom. On September the 20th, 1958, King was in a Harlem bookstore signing copies of Stride Towards Freedom when an odd-looking black woman, depicted in the centre there, Isola Ware Curry, approached him and asked him if he was Martin Luther King. No sooner had he said, "Yep, that's who I am," than she plunged a 7-inch letter opener deep into his chest, with the tip of the blade resting so close to his aorta that a sneeze would have been fatal. King waited calmly for an ambulance. If you look really closely at that newspaper picture, you can actually see the hilt of the blade sticking out of King's chest as he's waiting for the ambulance. Surgery saved his life, but left him with a cross-shaped scar over his heart. Had King died at that moment, he is unlikely to have been remembered in the way that he is. He would have been mourned by his adoring family and close associates, and by people in Dexter Avenue and other churches in the city that had come to cherish the preacher during the months of the boycott struggle. They would have attested that he was an extraordinary preacher and a minister who really wanted to make the gospel real in people's lives. Yet it's plausible to suggest that King might have had as little fame today as, say, the Florida-based leader Harry Moore, who was murdered with his wife on Christmas Day by the Ku Klux Klan in 1951. King was still in the making as a historical figure in 1957, still learning about how to use non-violence. And in the next talk, which starts at 6 o'clock, I'm going to be explaining how he learned to use that method. So thank you very much.